In 1889, the Chicago Auditorium building opened. It was a wonder of modern architecture. Yet after the first year, the tenants had a sinking feeling. Literally, as the building sank 18 inches during the first year. Now, while it is expected that all buildings will sink, 18 inches is a bit excessive. The reason for the sinking was that the architects failed to design a foundation that was properly suited for the soft clay soil upon which the building was constructed. Now, what does the sinking of the auditorium building have to do with education in the United States today? Actually, it's a great metaphor for what is currently happening. The buildings we are constructing represent our educational policies, with the soil being our philosophy of education. And a key element to that soil is our students. If we fail to properly grasp the role of students, then we will be ignoring the properties of the soil of education, and our buildings of educational policies will sink and even collapse. So let's talk a minute about our students, the key element to our soil or philosophy of education. In the United States today, two metaphors dominate how we view students. The first is to see students as products in the educational system. In this metaphor, students move down an assembly line. The teachers in schools do their work, filling the students with information, and at the end of the process, voila, we have an educated student. Subscribers to this metaphor advocate for the use of test scores and other big data measurements to assure quality control in the education system, just like any production line. The other way to view students is to see them as consumers of the education system. In this metaphor, we lay out a menu of options. The students, in conjunction with their parents, select the option that best meets their needs. The teachers in schools go about and prepare an education for the student, who then in turn consumes it. And after we're finished, lo and behold, we have an educated student. Adherents to this metaphor lobby for school choice and other market-driven reforms to improve the education system. Now, the problem with viewing students as products or consumers is that it disempowers them from their education. I went into education to make a difference in my students' lives. As time went on, I realized the difference I made was when I empowered them by giving them the skills and knowledge to go out for themselves and make a positive difference. Each of these metaphors take away a student's ownership and agency over their education, and as a result, their power to make a positive impact. A product has zero say in how it is produced. It is enacted upon. A consumer does have the opportunity to make a selection, but once that choice is made, they have no say in how the education service is prepared for them. Their only agency is to go back to the menu and make another selection. With almost no agency and ownership, we have an education system where our students are disenfranchised and disengaged from a system and a curriculum with seemingly little relevance to them. Secondly, students have no responsibility in either metaphor. If a product is defective, that is the fault of the producers, the teachers, and schools. After all, a product is an object. It does not choose to be defective. Likewise, if an education option fails to meet or exceed the expectation of the consumer, that is the fault of the preparer, the teachers, and schools. Just remember, the customer is always right, which is a dicey proposition if that customer is a first grader. Right? Well, if the students are not the products or the consumers, then what are they? Well, they are the clients of the education system. And when I use the word client, I mean it in a professional, service sector sense. So think of attorney-client, therapist-client, and doctor-patient. In order to have a successful outcome, the client needs to exercise responsibility, ownership, and agency. For instance, let's say I go to my family physician and he tells me, Russ, your blood pressure is too high. Some changes are needed. Getting more exercise and reducing your salt intake would be a good first step. Then I go home, kick back, relax on my sofa, eat potato chips, watch TV, and ignore my doctor. 6 months later, I go back, and wouldn't you know it, my blood pressure is even higher. Whose fault is that? Obviously, it's my fault for failing to take ownership and responsibility for my health. Yet when it comes to education, we all too often place 100% of the blame on the teachers and schools. And because jobs are at stake, the teachers and schools end up stripping away a student's agency and ownership over their education in order to meet the mandates set by policymakers. Perhaps the best explanation of the student as client metaphor came from one of my students this past year. When I told my classes about the subject of my TEDx talk, Emil, who's from Finland, came up to me after class. He told me about his principal in Finland who tells the students, if you want more freedom, you need to take more responsibility. What a wonderful summary of the student as client metaphor. You see, Finland already gets this. Perhaps we should join them. Well, if students are the clients in the education system, then how would this play out? One way concerns the evaluation of teachers. If we view students as products, then the use of standardized test scores as a measurement of quality control would be a great way to evaluate the teachers or the producers. However, the linking of student test scores to teaching effectiveness assumes the students are always putting forth their best effort on these exams. Having spent several years proctoring state-mandated exams and watching many students race through a 90-minute long test in 10 minutes or less, I can assure you this is not always the case. The lack of student effort on these mandated exams represents a significant limitation to using that data to evaluate teachers. In the consumer metaphor, the use of student surveys would be a great evaluative tool. After all, the student has spent the entire year with the teacher and, as a consumer, is in the best position to make a judgment. However, this runs the risk of becoming a popularity contest. Those teachers who really push their students to stretch and learn may score lower than the popular teacher whose students had a really good time but were never pushed to excel. Think about it. How many of you had a teacher who really pushed you and you resented them at the time? Yet down the road you were so thankful you had that teacher because of what you learned from them. That's one limitation of student surveys. In the student as client metaphor, the use of alumni surveys would yield better results. We would generate better feedback to see how well teachers were actually doing in preparing their students for their next step in their educational journey. One such example came from my mom, who's here today. She taught 6th grade for many years. At the end of her former students' 7th grade year, she sent up a survey for the junior high teachers to administer. The feedback she got from her alumni was quite useful. Practices that may have seemed too hard during their time in 6th grade were validated by her former students. In addition, they offered many useful suggestions for improvement. One such suggestion involved having the students rotate among their teachers for part of the day during their time in 6th grade. This would better prepare them for the changing of classes at the end of each period at junior high. Another way the student as client metaphor plays out concerns the student's role in the curriculum. Some people favor a teacher-centered model, which is aligned with the student as product metaphor. The teacher-centered model is highlighted by the use of direct instruction, where the teacher models and imparts content directly to the students. This is often called the sage on the stage approach, and it does work in some instances, especially those where students lack background knowledge. However, it doesn't always lend itself to retention of the content and can be disengaging if used extensively. Other people favor a student-centered model, which is rooted in the student as consumer metaphor. The student-centered model is highlighted by the constructivist approach, where students are engaged in making sense of the content. This would include techniques such as project-based and problem-based learning, where students go out and seek answers. In this case, the teacher serves as the guide on the side, and it does work in strengthening student engagement. However, it can result in sustained confusion for the student if they lack the background knowledge to successfully complete a project, or they reach erroneous conclusions based on misinformation they uncovered. A better way to view the student's role in the curriculum would be the learning-centered model, a great example of the student as client metaphor in action. The learning-centered model would negate this false dichotomy we have between direct instruction and constructivist approaches. As a professional, the teacher could use either or both depending on their students' or clients' needs. It would emphasize the process of learning, not who is in charge of it. Therefore, teachers could learn from their students, in addition to students learning from their teachers and peers. Now, if we look at all three models, we would notice that the first two, the teacher-centered and student-centered models, have a person at the middle. In contrast, the learning-centered model has an activity at its center. If we pursue the learning-centered model, then it means education is no longer to be viewed as an acquisition, but rather an action. And despite what the dictionary says, it would mean that education is not a noun, rather, education is a verb. By thinking of education this way, we would realize that no one can go out and buy an education. It has to be earned. And if the parents in the recent college cheating scandal had understood this, they never would have wasted the thousands of dollars that they did, because education is not a diploma on a wall. Instead, education is what you know, what you can do, how you can think, and how you can communicate. We cannot continue to construct buildings of education policy while ignoring the soil upon which those buildings rest. This presentation, just like my teaching career, has been to empower others, in this case, by challenging the preconceived notions and boundaries we may have about education. By changing the way we think about education, we can go out and ask better questions, interact with our children's teachers more effectively, and begin to change the dialogue over education reform so that the soil of education, of which our students are the most important part, is respected. By doing this, our students can become agents of their own learning and not the product of a market-driven industrial process, empowering them to create a better life for themselves. Thank you.